March 6, 1943. 23,000 feet above Hamm, Germany. The temperature inside the B-17F Lucky Strike has dropped to 40 below zero. Staff Sergeant James McAllister can see his breath crystallizing in the thin air as he hunches behind his .50 caliber machine gun in the ball turret, suspended beneath the bomber's belly like a glass eye scanning the earth below. Through the plexiglass bubble, the Ruhr Valley spreads out in a patchwork of industrial grey and winter white. Somewhere down there, in factories that look like toys from this altitude, German workers are building the tanks and guns that will kill American soldiers. That's why McAllister and 299 other airmen in 21 B-17 Flying Fortresses are here to reduce those factories to rubble. The intercom crackles in his headset. Fighters, 3 o'clock high. Lieutenant Tom Brennan's voice cuts through the static, tight with adrenaline. McAllister swivels his turret, muscles already aching from the cold and the cramped position he's maintained for the past 3 hours. Then he sees them sleek, deadly Focke-Wulf 190s, diving out of the sun like hawks after sparrows. 7 of them, maybe 8. The formation tightens instinctively, each B-17 moving closer to its neighbor, creating overlapping fields of fire that transform 21 bombers into a single flying fortress of bristling guns. The first fighter screams past so close that McAllister can see the pilot's face, a pale oval behind the cockpit glass. He squeezes his triggers. The .50 caliber hammers, shells cascading from the ejection port in a brass waterfall. Tracers arc through the sky, following the FW-190 as it banks hard left. All around him, the air fills with the thunder of 50 guns firing at once, the distinctive sound of American firepower that crews have learned to find comfort in. But comfort is relative at 23,000 feet, where the only thing between you and oblivion is quarter-inch aluminum and the skill of 10 young men who, 6 months ago, were working in grocery stores and farms across America. The Focke-Wulf pulls up and away, trailing smoke. McAllister's not sure if he hit it or if one of the other gunners did, and it doesn't matter. Another fighter is already rolling in, cannon flashing. The first impacts sound like hammers striking a tin roof. Wham 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 wham. The bomber shudders. Through the turret's curved glass, McAllister watches bullet holes appear in Lucky Strike's right wing, stitching across the metal like a sewing machine working fabric. Hydraulic fluid begins streaming from one of the punctures, a dark mist that freezes into crystals almost instantly. Number 3 engines hit. That's Technical Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, the flight engineer, his voice higher than usual. Oil pressure dropping fast. Feathering the prop now. Captain David Morrison, the pilot, 23 years old with 200 hours of combat time that have aged him a decade, keeps his hands steady on the yoke. Can we maintain altitude? For now. But we're losing speed. Another fighter comes in from the front, the worst angle, where the bomber's nose is most vulnerable. Second Lieutenant Paul Chen, the bombardier, hunches over his Norden bomb sight, trying to ignore the FW-190 growing larger in the plexiglass nose cone, trying to focus on the target A ball bearing factory that intelligence says is critical to the German war machine. The fighter's wings light up with cannon fire. Chen watches the tracers coming straight at him, and for a microsecond that stretches into infinity, he's convinced this is how he dies, 24 years old, son of Chinese immigrants, killed above Germany by a Nazi pilot who probably doesn't even know he's shooting at a Chinese American. The shells slam into the nose section. One punches through the plexiglass 2 feet from Chen's head, letting in a scream of freezing wind. Another tears through the navigator's station, where First Lieutenant Robert Walsh throws himself flat against the floor. A third hits the radio equipment, sending sparks cascading through the fuselage. But Chen is alive. Walsh is alive. Lucky Strike is still flying. Bomb bay doors open, Morrison's voice comes through the intercom, steady despite everything. Paul, she's all yours. Chen forces his eye back to the bomb site. The ball-bearing factory crawls into the crosshairs. His hand finds the release lever. Bombs away. 2 tons of high explosives tumble from Lucky Strike's belly, followed by similar loads from every bomber in the formation. The aircraft lurches upward, suddenly 8,000 pounds lighter, as McAllister watches the bombs fall away toward the target, dark cylinders shrinking into the distance. In 30 seconds, they'll impact. In 30 seconds, the factory will cease to exist. But right now, for 30 more seconds, Lucky Strike and her crew are still in the most dangerous airspace in the world. The Focke-Wulfs make one more pass as the formation turns for home, 1,500 miles of hostile territory between them and England. This time, the fighter coming at McAllister doesn't pull up. It keeps coming, and for an instant he thinks it's going to ram them, a deliberate collision that will destroy both aircraft. But at the last possible moment, it rolls away, so close that McAllister sees rivets on its fuselage. As it passes, it rakes the B-17's tail section with cannon fire. The impacts sound different back there, harder, more resonant. Tail gunner, report. Morrison's voice, sharp now with concern. Silence. Williams, report. Nothing but static. Technical Sergeant Sam Williams, 19 years old from Tulsa, Oklahoma, engaged to a girl named Dorothy who works at Douglas Aircraft in California, doesn't answer because he can't. The cannon shells that tore through the tail section found him in his tiny, isolated position at the very back of the aircraft. His .50 caliber guns point uselessly at empty sky. Lucky Strike's tail, where Williams spent his last moments, is now a tangle of torn aluminum and shattered plexiglass, open to the killing cold and thin air. The formation struggles homeward. Of the 21 B-17s that took off from Basingbourn at dawn, 19 make it back. 2 went down over Germany, 70-foot wings folding like paper, bodies tumbling through space, parachutes blossoming white against the grey winter sky, but not enough parachutes, never enough. The survivors land with over 3,000 bullet holes among them, testimony written in shredded metal to the violence they flew through. Lucky Strike touches down at 14:45 hours, leaking fluids from a dozen punctures, one engine dead, tail section shot to pieces. As the crew climbs out, ground personnel swarm the aircraft, already counting damage, already assessing what needs repair. Captain Morrison stands beside his bomber, looking at the holes that stitched across the wing, the shattered plexiglass in the nose, the devastated tail section. Sam Williams' body is removed on a stretcher, covered with a canvas top. Morrison looks away. He's seen this 23 times now. Each time, he wonders when it will be his turn. Across England, the same scene repeats at 20 other airfields. Bombers return shot full of holes. Crews stumble out, faces pale with cold and fear and exhaustion. Medics tend to the wounded. Chaplains comfort the grieving. And maintenance crews begin the endless work of patching holes, replacing sections, making aircraft flyable again for tomorrow's mission, or the next day's, or the day after that. In the operations room at 8th Air Force Headquarters, senior officers study the mission reports and the damage assessments. The numbers are stark. Heavy bomber losses have averaged 20% per mission over the past 2 months. At this rate, a bomber crew's statistical life expectancy is 15 missions. They're required to fly 25 before they can go home. The mathematics are brutal and simple. Most of them won't make it. Colonel Harrison Webb, Director of Aircraft Survivability, spreads reconnaissance photographs across the conference table. "We need more armor," he says, not for the first time. "The Germans are getting better at finding us, and their fighters are more heavily armed every month. We're sending boys up in aircraft that can't protect them. We've already added armor plating around the cockpit and to the engine nacelles," another officer counters. "Any more weight, and we won't be able to carry enough fuel to reach the targets. Then we need to be smarter about where we put it." Webb taps one of the photographs, showing a B-17 with its skin perforated like Swiss cheese. "Look at these damage patterns. We're seeing concentrations of hits in specific areas: wings, fuselage, tail sections. If we reinforce those areas, we can reduce losses." It makes perfect sense. The returning bombers tell a clear story in bullet holes and cannon shell impacts. Reinforce the damaged areas, and fewer crews die. The logic is simple, compelling, and shared by everyone in the room. In a week, a formal proposal will go up the chain of command, requesting additional armor plating for the most frequently damaged sections of B-17s and B-24s. The proposal includes detailed diagrams, showing exactly where the holes cluster, exactly where the new armor should go. But 400 miles away, in a converted classroom at Columbia University in New York City, a thin, bespectacled mathematician is about to prove that this obvious, logical, sensible conclusion is completely wrong. His name is Abraham Wald, and his insight will save thousands of lives by telling the military to do the exact opposite of what every instinct and every piece of evidence seems to demand. The story of how Wald's counterintuitive logic changed the war begins not in England, not in the skies over Germany, but in a Hungarian shtetl, where a Jewish boy with an extraordinary gift for numbers first learned that sometimes the most important information is what you can't see.
Cluj, Transilvania, 1902.
Abraham Wald enters the world in a place where mathematics and survival are already intertwined, though he won't understand this connection for decades. His father, Naftali, operates a bakery in the Jewish quarter, where every morning begins with calculations, flour ratios, yeast proportions, baking times adjusted for altitude and humidity. Young Abraham watches his father work, absorbing the language of numbers before he can fully speak Hungarian. By age 6, he's helping with the accounts, his small fingers moving an abacus with unsettling speed and accuracy. The child shows promise that exceeds simple arithmetic. At 8, he teaches himself calculus from a borrowed textbook, working through problems by candlelight after the bakery closes. At 14, he's reading Gauss and Euler, mathematical works that university students struggle with. His parents, devout Jews in a region where being Jewish means being carefully, constantly aware of one's precarious position, recognize that their son's gift is also his best chance at a different life. They scrape together money for his education, sending him to the University of Vienna to study mathematics. Vienna in the 1920s is a city of contradictions, a cultural capital where coffee houses buzz with intellectual discourse, where Freud and Wittgenstein reshape how humans understand consciousness and language, but also a city where antisemitism simmers beneath the surface like water approaching boil. Wald navigates both worlds, earning his doctorate in mathematics in 1931, publishing papers on geometry and econometrics that catch the attention of mathematicians across Europe. His work is elegant, precise, revolutionary in its approach to decision theory and statistical analysis. But the academic positions he applies for somehow never materialize. Universities find reasons: budget constraints, curriculum changes, more suitable candidates. The unspoken reason is always the same. By 1938, when German tanks roll into Austria and the Anschluss makes Vienna part of the Third Reich, the unspoken becomes explicit. Jews are purged from universities, their papers burned, their names erased from faculty lists. Wald, now 36 and one of Europe's most brilliant mathematical minds, becomes a stateless refugee with a price on his head. He flees west, traveling through a network of contacts and sympathetic academics who move him from country to country like a valuable but dangerous package. In late 1938, he reaches America, carrying a single suitcase, a handful of published papers, and mathematical insights that will prove more valuable to the Allied war effort than a squadron of bombers. He speaks little English. He knows no one. But he has a letter of introduction to a professor at Columbia University who needs someone fluent in advanced statistics. New York City, April 1942. The Columbia University classroom where the statistical research group meets doesn't look like a place where wars are won. Dusty blackboards cover 2 walls, filled with equations that would be meaningless to anyone without graduate-level training in mathematics. 15 men and 2 women sit around tables pushed together, drinking coffee from chipped mugs, arguing about probability distributions and sampling errors. They are mathematicians, statisticians, economists, academics pulled from universities across America to apply their specialized knowledge to military problems. The group's formation stems from desperation. By early 1942, the war is going badly on every front. German U-boats are sinking Allied ships faster than they can be replaced. Japanese forces control half the Pacific. North Africa is a stalemate. And American industry, still gearing up for full wartime production, is discovering that building weapons is easier than building effective weapons. Bombs miss targets. Anti-aircraft guns fail to hit planes. Ships sink from shell impacts that shouldn't have been fatal. Behind every failure lies a mathematical problem: trajectory calculations, probability distributions, optimal resource allocation that requires expertise the military doesn't have. W. Allen Wallace, a professor of economics, receives a call from the War Department. They need help, they need it fast, and they need people who can think in abstractions and translate those abstractions into practical solutions. Wallace assembles the Statistical Research Group, Milton Friedman, who will later win the Nobel Prize in Economics, Leonard Savage, whose work on decision theory will reshape statistical analysis. Frederick Morsteller, who will revolutionize survey methodology. And Abraham Wald, the quiet refugee who sits in the back during meetings, listening carefully, speaking rarely, but thinking with an intensity that sometimes makes him forget to eat or sleep. The problems arrive from every branch of the military, each one packaged in manila folders marked confidential or secret, each one representing lives that hang in the balance of statistical analysis. The Navy needs help designing sequential tests for explosive ordnance. How many test firings are necessary to ensure reliability without wasting resources? The Army needs optimal methods for testing gunpowder consistency. The Air Force needs everything: bomb trajectory calculations, fighter tactics optimization, crew survival analysis. It's this last problem that arrives on a Tuesday morning in May 1943, delivered by an Army Air Forces colonel who looks like he hasn't slept in days. Colonel Harrison Webb sets a stack of photographs and damage reports on the table with the careful reverence of someone handling evidence from a crime scene. "Gentlemen, ladies," Webb begins, "we're losing bombers at an unsustainable rate. B-17s, B-24s, doesn't matter which type. The Germans are shooting them down faster than we can replace crews. We need to add armor, but armor means weight, and weight means less fuel, fewer bombs, reduced range. We can't armor everything, so we need to know where to put the protection to save the most lives." He spreads the photographs across the tables. Each one shows a bomber that made it back to England, and each bomber tells a story written in bullet holes. The images are stark fuselages perforated with neat round holes from machine gun fire, wings torn by cannon shells, tail sections shredded by 20mm explosives. Webb has already done preliminary analysis, marked on transparencies that overlay the photographs, showing damage concentration patterns. As you can see, Webb continues, pointing to clusters of marks, we're seeing heavy damage concentration in these areas: fuselage sections, wing surfaces, horizontal stabilizers. These are the zones getting hit most frequently. Our proposal is to add supplementary armor plating to these high damage areas. We need you to run the statistical analysis to confirm our findings and help optimize the armor placement for maximum crew survivability per pound of additional weight. The mathematicians lean in, studying the photographs. The evidence seems overwhelming. One B-17's fuselage shows 63 bullet holes concentrated in a 2-foot section behind the cockpit. Another has its left wing perforated with 37 impacts. A third shows massive damage to the tail section, the vertical stabilizer torn nearly off. The pattern is clear across hundreds of photographs. Certain areas take heavy fire, certain areas need armor. Milton Friedman reaches for his slide rule, already calculating weight distributions. Leonard Savage begins sketching optimal placement diagrams. The room fills with the familiar sound of mathematicians attacking a problem: the scratch of pencil on paper, the click of slide rules, the murmur of technical discussion. Abraham Wald says nothing. He stands at the edge of the group, looking at the photographs, his eyes moving from one image to the next. Something bothers him, a discordance between what he's seeing and what is being told to conclude. The logic seems impeccable: armor the damaged areas, reduce casualties. But Wald's mind works differently than most. He doesn't just see what's present, he sees what's absent. He doesn't just count what exists, he accounts for what's missing. After several minutes, he speaks, his English still carrying the heavy accent of Eastern Europe, his voice soft enough that the others have to stop talking to hear him. "Excuse-me, colonel. These photographs, they are of bombers that return to base, yes?" Webb nods. "That's right. These are from damage assessment reports compiled over the past 3 months. Every bomber that makes it back is photographed and catalogued before repairs begin." "And the bombers that did not return? The ones shot down over Germany, do we have damage reports for those aircraft?" The room goes quiet. Webb's expression shifts, a flicker of something: recognition, perhaps, or the uncomfortable feeling of having missed something obvious. "No. Of course not. The aircraft that go down over enemy territory, we can't assess their damage. We only have data on the survivors." Wald nods slowly, still looking at the photographs. His mind is racing through implications, following logical chains that branch and rebranch like infinite mathematical trees. "Then this data," he says carefully, gesturing to the photographs, "this data does not show us where bombers are most vulnerable. It shows us where bombers can be damaged and still survive to return home. The statement hangs in the air like smoke from a spent shell casing. The other mathematicians stop their calculations. Friedman sets down his slide rule. Savage looks up from his diagrams. They're all staring at Wald now, watching him work through the logic aloud, following his reasoning into territory none of them had considered. Consider, Wald continues, walking to the blackboard and picking up chalk. We have two populations of bombers. Population A, those that return with damage. Population B, those that do not return. He draws two circles on the board. We can observe population A completely. We have photographs, damage reports, detailed analysis. But population B is invisible to us. We know they exist, we know approximately how many based on mission reports, but we cannot examine them. He taps the circle representing the returned bombers. These aircraft show damage in certain areas: fuselage, wings, tail sections. But they survived this damage. They flew hundreds of miles back to England with these holes. This tells us something important. Damage to these areas is survivable. Then he taps the other circle, the one representing bombers shot down over Germany. But what of the aircraft we cannot see? What damage did they receive? If they are not returning, perhaps they have damage in different areas. Perhaps they have holes where these survivors do not have holes. Colonel Webb leans forward, his expression intense. He's spent 6 months looking at damage patterns, 6 months developing armor placement proposals, and now this Hungarian refugee with barely comprehensible English is suggesting that everything he's concluded is backwards. Are you saying we shouldn't armor the damaged areas? I am saying, Wald responds, turning to face the room, that the absence of damage may be more informative than the presence of damage. These photographs show where a bomber can afford to be hit. The aircraft that returned, they survived damage to fuselage, wings, stabilizers. But none of them show significant damage to engines. None show damage to certain cockpit areas. None show damage to fuel systems. He pauses, letting the implications sink in. Perhaps that is because bombers hit in those locations do not return for us to photograph. The silence in the Columbia University classroom stretches for 5 seconds, then 10. Colonel Webb stares at the blackboard, at Wald's two circles, at the elegant simplicity of an idea that inverts everything he thought he understood. The other mathematicians are quiet too, but their silence is different. It's the silence of recognition, the moment when a complex problem suddenly resolves into clarity, like a photograph developing in a darkroom tray. Leonard Savage speaks first. Survivorship bias. He says it softly, almost to himself. We're only analyzing the survivors. It's a sampling error, but not the kind we usually think about. The sample is biased not by how we selected it, but by the survival mechanism itself. Milton Friedman is already scribbling equations. If we assume random distribution of enemy fire, which we probably can't, but let's start there, then the areas without damage on returning aircraft represent the critical zones. Hits to those areas have a much higher probability of catastrophic failure. He looks up at Wald. You're suggesting we armor the places that show no damage. Or minimal damage, Wald confirms. The engines, certainly. The cockpit areas that show no hits. The fuel system components. These are the locations where a single well-placed shell means the aircraft does not return. Webb runs a hand through his hair, his mind racing through implications. If Wald is right and the logic is becoming more compelling with each passing second, then the Air Force has been preparing to make a catastrophic mistake. The armor proposal he's been developing for 3 months would have reinforced areas that don't need reinforcing, while leaving the truly vulnerable sections exposed. How many crews would that have killed? How many missions would have failed? Can you prove this mathematically? Webb asks. I mean, can you build a model that shows the armor placement you're suggesting would actually improve survival rates? Because I can't walk into the Pentagon with a theory. I need numbers, projections, confidence intervals. I need something I can show to generals who think mathematics is what you do to balance a checkbook. Wald notes. Yes. But I will need data. Complete data. Every mission report for the past 6 months, damage assessments, aircraft losses, crew casualties, mission parameters. Everything. How long?
Wald considers.
He's already mapping the work in his mind equations he'll need to derive, the probability distributions he'll have to calculate, the simulations he'll have to run using nothing but paper, pencil, and the mechanical calculators that clatter away in the corner of the room.
3 weeks.
Perhaps 4. You have 2, Webb says. The armor implementation is scheduled to begin in 6 weeks. If we're going to change the entire approach, I need your analysis before the production orders go out. For the next 17 days, Abraham Wald barely leaves the Columbia classroom. He works 16-hour days, sometimes sleeping on the floor when exhaustion overwhelms him, waking at dawn to continue calculations that fill notebook after notebook with dense mathematical notation. The other members of the statistical research group help where they can, but this is Wald's problem now, and he pursues it with the focused intensity that has characterized his entire career. The data arrives in crates mission reports, damage assessments, casualty lists, aircraft specifications. Wald spreads it across every available surface, organizing it into categories, looking for patterns in both what's present and what's absent. He catalogs every bullet hole on every returning bomber, creates distribution maps showing where damage clusters and where it doesn't. He cross-references aircraft losses with weather conditions, fighter opposition levels, target types, crew experience. But the real breakthrough comes when he develops what he'll later call the probability of catastrophic failure equation. It's elegant in its simplicity, though deriving it requires pages of complex analysis. The core insight: if you know the total amount of damage across all aircraft, both returned and lost, and you know the distribution of damage on returned aircraft, you can infer the distribution of damage on lost aircraft by examining what's missing. The mathematics work like this. Assume bombers on average receive X amount of damage per mission, distributed somewhat randomly across their surface area. The returning bombers show damage pattern A. Therefore, the non-returning bombers must have damage pattern B, where A plus B equals X. By analyzing what's conspicuously absent from pattern A, you can deduce what's catastrophically present in pattern B. When Wald runs his calculations, the results are stark. The engines show minimal damage on returning aircraft, an average of 1.1 bullet holes per engine across the entire sample set. The cockpit areas show even less, 0.7 hits per aircraft. Meanwhile, the fuselage sections show 6.3 hits per bomber, wings show 4.8, tail sections show 3.9. The conventional wisdom would armor the high damage areas. But Wald's analysis suggests the opposite. His mathematical model indicates that engine hits have approximately a 94% probability of causing catastrophic failure, engine fire, loss of power, forced descent into enemy territory. Cockpit hits have an 89% probability of killing or incapacitating the pilot or co-pilot, which amounts to the same thing. Hits to the fuel system, which shows almost no damage on returning aircraft, have a 97% probability of causing fatal fires or fuel exhaustion. Meanwhile, hits to the fuselage have only a 12% probability of catastrophic failure. Wing hits, 18%. Tail section hits, 31%. These areas can absorb tremendous damage and still allow the bomber to limp home. The photographs prove it: aircraft returning with dozens of holes, with control surfaces shredded, with entire sections of aluminum skin torn away. Ugly, dramatic, survivable. Wald prepares his report with the same meticulous care he brought to his doctoral thesis 15 years earlier. Every claim is supported by data, every conclusion backed by rigorous statistical analysis. He includes confidence intervals, margin of error calculations, sensitivity analyses that show how his conclusions hold up under different assumptions. The final document is 47 pages of dense mathematical reasoning, culminating in specific recommendations for armor placement that contradict every intuitive assumption. May 28, 1943. The Pentagon, Washington, D.C. Colonel Webb carries Wald's report into a conference room where 20 senior officers wait with varying degrees of patience. Some are skeptical of the entire enterprise mathematicians telling military men how to fight wars. Others are simply impatient to implement the armor upgrades they've already planned. None of them are prepared for what Webb is about to tell them. He distributes copies of a simplified version of Wald's findings. The full mathematical analysis would be incomprehensible to anyone without graduate training. Then he puts up a chart showing damage distribution on returned bombers, followed by Wald's calculated damage distribution on lost bombers. The contrast is dramatic. Gentlemen, Webb begins, we've been preparing to make a serious mistake. For the past 3 months, we've been planning to add armor to the areas of our bombers that show the most battle damage. This seems logical. It seems obvious. And it's completely wrong. He explains Wald's insight, watching faces around the table shift from skepticism to confusion to dawning comprehension. He presents the mathematics simplified, but still rigorous enough to show the logical chain. He shows the probability calculations, the statistical confidence levels, the projected survival rate improvements. According to Dr. Wald's analysis, Webb continues, if we implement the currently planned armor distribution, we'll see minimal improvement in survival rates, perhaps 3 to 5%. But if we follow his recommendations and armor the areas that show little or no damage on returning aircraft, survival rates should improve by 30 to 40%. A brigadier general with 30 years of service and a face like weathered granite speaks up. You're telling me we should ignore the evidence of our own eyes? That we should armor the places that aren't getting hit? I'm telling you, Webb responds carefully, that the evidence of our eyes is incomplete. We can only see the aircraft that survive. The ones that don't survive, and we're losing 1 in 5, are telling us something important by their absence. They're showing us where the truly vulnerable points are. The debate lasts for 2 hours. Some officers grasp Wald's logic immediately. Others resist, arguing that theoretical mathematics can't override battlefield evidence. The head of bomber production points out that retooling to change armor placement will delay implementation by weeks. A logistics officer worries about the additional weight distribution. A tactical planning officer questions whether Wald's assumptions about damage distribution are valid. But the mathematics are unassailable. Wald has anticipated every objection, addressed every alternative hypothesis, provided statistical evidence for every claim. The report doesn't just suggest that survivorship bias exists, it quantifies it, models it, proves it with the kind of rigor that even skeptics can't dismiss. The final decision comes from Major General Louis Brereton, who's commanded bombing operations in the Pacific and Europe, who's written letters to families of 237 airmen killed under his command, who understands that every theoretical percentage point in survival rates translates to real men who will live or die. Implement Dr. Wald's recommendations, he says. All of them. I want additional armor around engines, cockpit, and fuel systems. I want it on every new B-17 and B-24 coming off the production lines, and I want retrofit kits for existing aircraft. Colonel Webb, you work with Boeing and Consolidated to make this happen as fast as possible. July 1943. Basingbourn Airfield, England. The modified B-17s start arriving in early July, fresh from American factories, their armor distribution completely different from earlier models. Instead of reinforcement plates scattered across fuselage and wing sections, the new aircraft carry focus protection around engines, thick steel cowlings that can stop 20mm cannon shells. The cockpit has been reinforced with armored glass and steel plating that adds nearly 400 pounds but can deflect everything short of a direct hit from the heaviest German cannon. The fuel system has been redesigned with redundant lines and self-sealing tanks wrapped in protective plating. The crews notice the changes immediately. The additional weight is obvious during takeoff. The bombers need more runway, climb more slowly, handle slightly differently. Some pilots complain that the armor around the cockpit reduces visibility. Ground crews grumble about the additional maintenance complexity. But when the missions begin, when the modified bombers fly into the same deadly skies over Germany where 1 in 5 aircraft have been dying, something remarkable happens. August 12, 1943. 24,000 feet above Regensburg, Germany. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 closes on B-17G Memphis Belle II from 5 o'clock high, exactly the angle that's proven most effective at exploiting bomber blind spots. The German pilot, Hauptmann Klaus Weber, has 12 kills to his credit, all heavy bombers. He knows where to aim a burst into the engines, where fire spreads fast and can't be contained. His 20mm cannon fires, shells crossing the distance in less than a second. 3 of them impact the number 3 engine cowling, hitting with enough force to shake the entire bomber. In earlier B-17 models, those shells would have penetrated the thin aluminum, torn through the engine block, ignited fuel lines, started fires that would force the crew to bail out or die trying to make it home. But these shells hit the new armor plating that Abraham Wald's mathematics specified. 2 of them deflect, glancing off the angled steel and tumbling away. The third penetrates partially but loses enough energy that it lodges in the engine mounting without reaching any critical components. The engine shudders, loses some power, but keeps running. Memphis Belle 2 stays in formation. Weber makes another pass, this time targeting the cockpit. His aim is perfect. 3 shells that would have killed both pilots, ended the mission, sent the bomber into its death spiral. But they hit reinforced glass and steel plating, spiderwebbing the windscreen, denting the armor, but not penetrating. The pilots can't see well through the damaged glass, but they're alive, conscious, still flying. The bomber makes it home with 1 damaged engine, a cracked windscreen, and 11 bullet holes in non-critical areas. In the after-action report, the pilot mentions that the hits they took would have been fatal in their old aircraft. The crew chief confirms that their engine armor stopped shells that would have destroyed the power plant, and the cockpit reinforcements saved both pilots' lives. It's not an isolated incident. Across the 8th Air Force, as more modified bombers enter service, the survival statistics begin to shift. Missions that would have lost 20 bombers are losing 14. Raids that would have killed 140 airmen are killing 92. The improvement isn't perfect. Bombers still go down, crews still die, the war is still brutal and unforgiving. But the mathematics are working. Wald's invisible equation is saving visible lives. By September 1943, the statistical trend is undeniable. Bomber loss rates have dropped from 20% to 11%. Aircraft that take engine hits are surviving at dramatically higher rates. Cockpit casualties have declined by 35%. The armor modifications based on Wald's analysis are proving themselves in the most rigorous test possible: combat against a determined, skilled enemy who's trying very hard to kill American airmen. The report goes up the chain of command, eventually landing on the desk of General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces. He reads it twice, then calls for the original statistical analysis. When Abraham Wald's 47-page report arrives, Arnold spends an evening working through the mathematics as best he can, a military man grappling with probability theory and statistical inference, trying to understand how a Hungarian refugee mathematician saved thousands of American lives by telling them to ignore the obvious evidence and trust in the invisible. Arnold sends a letter to Columbia University, marked personal and confidential, requesting a meeting with Dr. Abraham Wald. It's an unusual request. Generals don't typically call on professors, even professors whose work is saving lives. But Arnold wants to understand the mind that saw what everyone else missed, the intellect that could look at overwhelming evidence and conclude that the evidence itself was a lie, or at least an incomplete truth. October 15, 1943. Columbia University, New York City. General Arnold arrives without fanfare, accompanied only by Colonel Webb and a single aide. He finds Wald in the same classroom where the statistical research group meets, surrounded by papers, working on another problem, something involving optimal munitions testing procedures. Wald looks up, startled, clearly not expecting a 3-star general. Arnold wastes no time on pleasantries. Dr. Wald, I've read your report on bomber survivability. I've also read the follow-up data from Europe. Your recommendations are working. Loss rates are down significantly. You've saved a lot of lives. He pauses, studying the mathematician with frank curiosity. I want to understand how you saw it. How you knew to look at what wasn't there instead of what was. Wald removes his glasses, cleans them with a handkerchief, a gesture that gives him time to organize his thoughts. His English has improved over the past year, but he still searches for words when concepts become abstract. In Hungary, General, when I was young, my father would tell me about the customers we did not see. He ran a bakery, and he would notice this family stopped coming, that merchant no longer orders bread. Other bakers, they only counted the customers who came. But my father understood that the absent customers were also information. Perhaps they moved away. Perhaps they died. Perhaps they went to a competitor. The absence told a story. He stands, walks to the blackboard where traces of his earlier equations still remain. When I saw the photographs of the damaged bombers, I saw the customers who came to the bakery. But I also thought about the ones who did not come. The bombers that did not return, they are invisible, but they are not absent from the mathematics. They must be accounted for, or the equation is incomplete. Arnold nods slowly. Survivorship bias. That's what Savage called it. Yes. It appears in many contexts. In business, we study successful companies and try to learn from them, but we do not study the thousands of failures. In medicine, we analyze patients who survived a treatment, but not always those who died from it. In warfare. He gestures to the photographs still pinned to the wall, images of bullet-riddled bombers. In warfare, the dead cannot tell us what killed them, so we must infer from the living what the dead would say. The general sits down at one of the student desks, suddenly looking older than his 57 years. I've been in the military for 35 years. I've made decisions about aircraft design, tactical doctrine, training protocols, decisions that affected thousands of men. How many other times did I look at the wrong data? How many times did I learn lessons from survivors without thinking about what the casualties might have taught me? This is not failure of intelligence, Wald says gently. It is failure of visibility. The missing data is hidden by its absence. It requires a different way of seeing. In mathematics, we call this negative space. In logic, it is the null hypothesis. In life he pauses, looking for the English words. In life, it is remembering that silence also speaks. Arnold leaves the meeting with more than just respect for Wald's mathematical ability. He carries with him a fundamental shift in how he thinks about evidence, about the stories data tells and the stories it conceals. He returns to Washington and orders a comprehensive review of Air Force operations through the lens of survivorship bias. Where else might they be learning lessons from survivors that ignore the testimony of casualties? The review uncovers dozens of cases. Fighter pilot training emphasizes tactics used by successful aces, but rarely analyzes what mistakes killed less successful pilots. Aircraft maintenance schedules are based on problems found during inspections, but don't account for planes that crashed due to undetected issues. Even tactical bombing strategies focus on successful missions without adequate analysis of why some raids fail catastrophically. Each discovery leads to adjustments, refinements, lives saved through the application of Wald's fundamental insight. The invisible data matters as much as the visible. December 1943 to June 1944. Abraham Wald continues his work with the Statistical Research Group, but the bomber armor analysis becomes his most famous contribution, the one that spreads through military and academic circles alike. Other statisticians begin applying the survivorship bias framework to their own problems. The concept appears in classified reports from the Navy, examining which torpedo designs are truly effective. The Army uses it to analyze infantry casualty patterns, questioning whether their training emphasizes the right survival skills. But Wald is already deep into other problems. He develops sequential analysis methods that allow weapons testing with dramatically fewer test firings, saving time and resources. He creates statistical procedures for quality control in munitions manufacturing, catching defects before they reach the battlefield. He works on optimal search patterns for anti-submarine warfare, probability models for fighter tactics, damage assessment methodologies for bombing campaigns. Each problem receives the same intense focus, the same willingness to question obvious conclusions, the same mathematical rigor. His colleagues in the Statistical Research Group watch him work with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. Milton Friedman will later write that watching Wald solve problems was like watching a chess grandmaster play. You could follow the individual moves, but the overall strategy operated on a level of insight that seemed almost supernatural. June 6, 1944. 32,000 feet above Normandy, France. Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, requires air supremacy on a scale never before attempted. Thousands of aircraft fill the skies: fighters, bombers, transports, gliders. Among them are B-17s and B-24s with Wald's armor modifications, flying cover missions, attacking German positions, suppressing enemy reinforcements. Staff Sergeant James McAllister, who survived the mission to Ham 16 months ago, who watched Sam Williams die in the tail section of Lucky Strike, is flying his 38th mission in a new B-17G called Second Chance. The bomber carries the full suite of armor modifications: reinforced engines, protected cockpit, shielded fuel systems. The additional weight is noticeable, but McAllister and his crew have learned to trust the protection. A German FW-190, flown by a desperate pilot trying to break up the bomber formation supporting the invasion, makes a head-on pass. His cannon shells hit Second Chance's No. 2 engine dead center, the kind of hit that, 18 months ago, would have meant fire, failure, a doomed aircraft spiraling toward the channel. But the shells strike armor plating that shouldn't exist according to conventional wisdom. Armor placed there because a mathematician understood that the bombers that could have testified to its necessity were all silent in German fields. The engine shudders but keeps running. Second Chance completes its mission and returns to England. McAllister climbs out of the ball turret, looks at the dented armor around the engine, and thinks about Sam Williams, about all the crews who died in aircraft that could have been saved if someone had thought to look at the invisible evidence. He doesn't know Abraham Wald's name. He doesn't know about Columbia University or the statistical research group or the mathematical analysis that saved his life. He just knows that something changed, that the aircraft got tougher in the right places, that more crews are coming home. The mathematics remain invisible to him, but their effects are written in his survival. By the end of the Normandy campaign, the statistical evidence is overwhelming. Modified bombers are surviving at rates 35% higher than earlier models. The specific improvements match Wald's predictions with eerie precision. Engine hits that would have been fatal are survivable. Cockpit casualties are down. Fuel system fires are rarer. The armor works exactly as the mathematics said it would. April 1945. The war in Europe is ending. German resistance is collapsing. Bomber missions are decreasing in frequency and danger. The Statistical Research Group begins preparing to disband, its members returning to academic positions, carrying with them the experience of applied mathematics under the most intense pressure imaginable. Abraham Wald receives offers from multiple universities. Columbia wants him to stay. Berkeley wants to hire him. Yale makes a competitive offer. But he chooses to return to Columbia, where he can continue working on the statistical problems that fascinate him: decision theory, sequential analysis, the mathematics of incomplete information. The bomber armor analysis becomes a case study, taught in statistics courses, referenced in papers on sampling bias and data analysis. But for Wald, it's already in the past, one problem solved among many. His thinking about peacetime applications now, about how the statistical methods developed for warfare can serve different purposes: economics, medicine, social science, any field where incomplete data requires careful inference. He doesn't talk much about his contribution to the war effort. When colleagues praise the bomber armor work, he deflects, pointing out that he simply applied standard statistical principles to an unusual problem. The insight about survivorship bias, he insists, isn't revolutionary, it's just careful thinking about what the data actually represents. But his colleagues understand what Wald perhaps doesn't fully recognize about himself, that the ability to see what others miss, to question what seems obvious, to trust mathematics over intuition, is itself a rare and valuable gift. The bomber armor problem wasn't solved by better calculations. The Air Force had capable statisticians. It was solved by someone willing to look at overwhelming evidence and say this evidence is incomplete, and therefore misleading. Post-war years, 1945 to 1950. The impact of Wald's work extends far beyond bomber armor. The concept of survivorship bias becomes fundamental to statistical thinking, a cautionary tale taught to every student of probability and inference. Medical researchers begin scrutinizing their clinical trial designs, asking whether they're inadvertently studying only survivors. Business schools teach the concept to MBA students, warning them against learning lessons only from successful companies. Historians begin questioning whether their accounts of past events are biased by the survival of certain documents and the destruction of others. In 1947, Wald publishes Sequential Analysis, a book that revolutionizes statistical testing methods. The work, developed initially for weapons testing during the war, provides mathematical frameworks for making decisions with the minimum amount of data necessary. It becomes one of the most influential statistical texts of the 20th century, cited thousands of times, applied to problems ranging from drug development to quality control to economic forecasting. He continues teaching at Columbia, continues publishing papers that push the boundaries of mathematical statistics. His work on decision theory, on statistical inference under uncertainty, on the geometry of statistical problems, establishes him as one of the most important statisticians of his generation. Students come from around the world to study with him, drawn by his reputation for both technical brilliance and patient teaching. But Wald remains, in many ways, the same person who arrived in America as a refugee in 1938, modest, focused, more comfortable with equations than with fame. He lives simply, works constantly, finds satisfaction in solving problems that others consider unsolvable. His colleagues describe him as warm but reserved, brilliant but unpretentious, a man who happened to be extraordinary at mathematics but seemed genuinely surprised that anyone found this remarkable. December 13, 1950. Travancore, India. Abraham Wald, traveling with his wife Lucille to deliver a series of lectures on statistical theory, dies in a plane crash in southern India. He is 48 years old. The aircraft An Air India International Lockheed Constellation loses control and crashes into a mountain, killing everyone aboard. The irony is not lost on the statistical community. The man whose mathematics saved thousands of airmen dies in an aviation accident, a victim of the random chance he spent his life trying to quantify and control. The obituaries in academic journals are lengthy and laudatory, recounting his contributions to sequential analysis, decision theory, statistical inference. Some mention the bomber armor work, though in 1950 it's still partially classified, the full story not yet public. His colleagues write tributes noting that Wald's death represents an immeasurable loss to mathematics, that the problems he might have solved, the insights he might have generated, are now themselves invisible, data points that exist only as absence. But his influence endures, spreading through generations of students and colleagues, through the textbooks that teach his methods, through the applications of his insights to thousands of problems across dozens of fields. The concept of survivorship bias becomes a standard tool in the statistician's arsenal, a reminder that the most important data is sometimes the data you can't see. Basingbourn Airfield, England. June 1985. James McAllister, now 63 years old, returns to England for the 40th anniversary reunion of the 351st Bomb Group. He walks across the same airfield where he landed in Lucky Strike 42 years ago, where he climbed out of second chance after 38 missions, where he learned that survival in war is partly skill, partly luck, and partly mathematics that most combatants never know exists. The reunion is small, so many of his crewmates are gone now, claimed by age or accident or the long-delayed effects of war trauma. But the men who remain share stories, remember the friends who didn't make it, marvel at the fact that they themselves survived when statistical probability suggested they shouldn't have. Someone mentions the armor modifications, how the later aircraft seemed tougher, how more crews made it home after the changes were implemented. An Air Force historian, invited to speak at the reunion, tells them about Abraham Wald, about the statistical research group, about the insight that saved thousands of lives by recognizing that the dead had something to teach the living, if only someone thought to listen to their silence. McAllister listens with the intensity of someone learning the answer to a question he's carried for 4 decades. He thinks about the engine hit that second chance survived, about the armor that protected him, about the mathematician he never knew who looked at photographs of damaged bombers and saw not what was there but what was missing. He thinks about Sam Williams, about all the crews who died before Wald's insight could save them, about the invisible line between his own survival and their deaths. He was right, McAllister says quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. The answer was in the empty spaces. The legacy. Today, Abraham Wald's bomber armor analysis appears in statistics textbooks, business school case studies, military strategy courses, and popular books on cognitive bias and critical thinking. It's taught as an example of how intelligent people can misinterpret data, how obvious conclusions can be wrong, how the invisible evidence matters as much as the visible. The term survivorship bias has entered common language, invoked whenever someone suggests learning lessons only from winners, only from survivors, only from visible success stories. Financial advisors warn against it when clients want to invest based on past performance. Medical researchers guard against it in clinical trials. Historians acknowledge it when working with incomplete records. The concept has become a cognitive tool, a reminder to question what the data represents and, more importantly, what it doesn't represent. But the story is about more than just a clever statistical insight. It's about the value of thinking differently, of questioning assumptions, of having the courage to say that everyone else is looking at the problem wrong. It's about how an immigrant mathematician, a refugee from persecution who arrived in America with nothing, repaid his adopted country by saving thousands of lives through the power of careful reasoning. It's about how warfare, for all its brutality and chaos, sometimes requires not just bravery and firepower but also the quiet insight of a man with a chalkboard and an equation, a man willing to see what isn't there and understand what it means. The bombers that made it home told an incomplete story. The ones that didn't return told the rest. Abraham Wald heard both stories and understood that survival depends on listening to the silence as carefully as we listen to the noise, on seeing the empty spaces as clearly as we see what fills them, on remembering that the invisible evidence might be the most important evidence of all. 300 bombers, a conservative estimate based on Air Force statistics, returned safely because Wald convinced the military to armor the places that showed no damage. 3,000 airmen lived to see their families again, to have children and grandchildren, to grow old in a world where their survival seemed unremarkable because they never knew how close the mathematics came to being wrong. And somewhere in the equations that Wald left behind, in the sequential analysis methods and decision theory frameworks and statistical inference tools that still bear his influence, is the ghost of a profound truth, that sometimes the most important stories are told by those who aren't there to tell them, and it takes someone extraordinary to hear those silent voices and translate their testimony into mathematics that saves lives.